Hello guys, Winston here. I got back from a road trip around California about a week ago, and if you follow me on Instagram, you might have seen a project that I posted while I was out there of a fairly important piece I was commissioned to do. My roommate Kyle had been secretly planning on proposing to his then girlfriend in the middle of our trip, but the ring box that he'd received from the jewelry store was just too big to carry inconspicuously. So about a week before we were scheduled to fly out, he asked me if I'd be able to make him a slimmer ring box. He'd done some digging around on Etsy and found some designs that looked decent and manufacturable, but while I could copy one of them directly, the inner engineer in me needed to improve on what I saw. Because we would be traveling and I didn't know where Kyle would be hiding the ring box, I wanted to make sure that if the contents of his bags shifted or the box was jostled, the lid wouldn't be dislodged. The designs I saw on Etsy had no provisions for preventing lateral slip between box halves, so I designed a box with a small lip that would fix the relative positions of the base and the lid. This feature was on the order of about a 1/16 of an inch in size. Then I added a couple thousandths of an inch of clearance between the base and the lid. This would make it pretty close to a snap fit, and combined with a magnet would prevent accidental opening of the box. I measured out the dimensions of the ring itself to determine the size of the cavity needed. The wood from my project was a small piece of African mahogany that I'd squirreled away about a year or two ago for just such an occasion. I mean, for a small project like a paperweight-sized tchotchke. Rest easy, ladies of YouTube, I am still single. Once I had these key features defined, I moved on to the cam process. Now don't believe the lies of video editing, this was not my first time setting up my toolpaths. I arrived at these settings through trial and error. There are things you learn as you go about the material you're working with that inform these cutting parameters. For example, the recessed pockets for the magnets create small areas that are quite thin-walled. You need to take easy, shallow passes around these features to prevent the wood fibers from tearing out. Although the bottom pocket of the ring box would be covered with fabric, the lid would be completely naked. I needed to make sure that the pocket for the ring cavity had a good surface finish. It would be too small to get in there with sandpaper, so I added in an additional pocketing operation at full depth with a small step over to clean up any machining marks from my roughing pass. To keep the box pieces secure, I programmed in some tabs. These would be easy enough to sand off later. I would also be manually rounding over the top and bottom edges of the box. I clamped down on my mahogany and cut a pair of bases and lids. Since this was a project I couldn't afford to screw up, I cut one more than I needed. I had to finish this project a couple days before departure so I could apply a spray poly finish and have it fully dry before use. It would be a terrible thing if this ring box got stuck closed. Once I had my parts machined, I cut them out and cleaned them up by hand. I needed to engrave Kyle and Lindsay's initials in the top of the box, so I took some advice from you guys and sealed the top of my lids first with a quick coat of spray poly to ward against excess paint seeping into the pores of the wood where I didn't want it. Then I dropped my first lid into the Nomad vise and did a quick V-carving. I started a couple thousandths high and inched my 0 point down until my letters were the desired thickness and clearly defined. I wanted to keep the calligraphy as delicate looking as possible. After painting in the letters and sanding off the excess, I finished sealing the wood. And at some point during this process, I also glued in the 1/4-inch neodymium magnets that would keep my box closed. Now I needed to figure out how to hold the ring. You need something soft and compliant like fabric to snugly grip the ring and prevent it from rattling around inside the box. My roommate suggested taking a trip to the craft store, but for such a small amount of fabric, I figured I could improvise something. Looking around my room, the handles on my organizer boxes caught my eye. They were the right width, and the canvas-like texture wouldn't look all that out of place in the ring box. Plus, if I did some creative folding, there would be 0 sewing required. I figured out how many folds were needed to provide the thickness required to snugly hold the ring, and locked in the fabric with a dab of E6000. Then, Kyle and I test fit the ring, which up until now had been represented by a washer. Everything was set for the big moment. And when it came, things went off without a hitch. The box remained hidden and sealed until the big day, and upon successful presentation of the ring, Lindsay said yes, although technically the first word out of her mouth was no. Needless to say, the rest of our road trip was like one big celebration of their engagement. If you're curious about where we went, check out the other video I posted today. Anyhow, I really can't be happier with how this project turned out, despite the fact that it took a couple discarded prototypes to get here. Note to self, the wildly varying density of zebra wood, means it's really easy for chunks of fiber to be pulled out of the wood with an upcutting end mill. That's all I have for this week. I want to thank you all very much for watching, and I'll be back in a week or two with one more CNC related project that I did for this trip.